They've got a chronic overspending habit, and they're now promising even more entitlements to millions more people. That is kind of a perfect historical setup for going and corrupting the central bank and going and corrupting the monetary system. It's not happening right now. It's not happening yet, but we're moving even closer to that kind of scenario.
The South African government is running out of money to such an extent that earlier this month, it seemed that it would not be able to pay up to 200,000 disability grants through the Social Security Agency, or SASSA. What are the implications of this? Well, joining me to discuss is Russell Lamberti of ETM Macro Advisors. Russell is an economist. Russell, welcome to the CRA channel. Could you tell our audience what are the implications of the government's deteriorating fiscal position, and how do you see this playing forward in terms of the emerging risks?
Yeah, look, I think this is a very, very interesting development because for the first time, you've got a real open admission by government that they're running short of finances to fund a very specific and very socially sensitive and politically sensitive and important area, which is social welfare grants, and of course the extension of some of these things during this COVID lockdown period. So that in and of itself is, I think, very interesting. It's not often that you get governments openly admitting that they're kind of running out of funds. And then you've got to juxtapose this with a very recent ANC, I think, Cabinet Lekgotla announcement that was tweeted out on President Cyril Ramaphosa's official Twitter account, which is suggesting an extension of social grants and welfare payments to unemployed people who do not already receive social welfare assistance. Now that, I haven't done the exact maths on that, Dave, but that probably extends at the very least into the hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people. And certainly if you include, discouraged workers and sort of chronically unemployed people who are not receiving state assistance, this would be a huge number. And so these are two kind of ideas that are very much in tension. On the one hand, you've got the government claiming to be running out of money. On the other hand, they want to extend these things. And we've got to start thinking very clearly. I think the salient point here for me are the political pressures building towards how are you going to fund this? And we've got to start thinking about the integrity of the Reserve Bank, the integrity of the central bank. When governments get into this kind of trouble to fund such politically sensitive kind of entitlements, if you like, the integrity of the Reserve Bank and the desire to use the Reserve Bank to print money and to debase the currency to fund these sort of payments, I think becomes very important. So that's, for me, where I'm focusing. I'm not saying it's the only focus in this issue, but I think how the Reserve Bank is potentially going to be used down the line to fund these sorts of things becomes very important.
So, Russell, obviously government borrowing has increased dramatically and is set to increase to approximately 100% debt to GDP ratio over the medium term, basically over the next 3 years. Could be even higher than that. That's Treasury projections. So there is obviously this concern that you've raised that pressure could be brought to bear on the Reserve Bank to ease monetary policy and to print money, as you suggest. What would be some of the potential second order effects of that? Any negative consequences that could arise from such an action?
Well, look, I mean, the way that the SARB would fund social welfare payments, or could fund social welfare payments, let me put it that way rather, is that it can really inject that money directly into recipient bank accounts. Now, you might say, well, this is just kind of naked Zimbabwe-style money printing. This is what we are seeing now emerging in a number of countries, and the US is basically doing this. The US is funding stimulus checks, welfare checks directly into household bank accounts. How is it doing it? Well, it's doing it officially through the Treasury Department. But we know that what's really going on is that the Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve in the United States, is really printing the money. It's being sort of funneled through some sort of opaque special purpose vehicles and then being distributed by the US Treasury. But we're not far away from kind of direct money printing for people. This is what modern monetary theorists kind of advocate for, that the central bank should really just be directly funding the treasury. Why issue all these bonds to the public, and why run all these deficits when you can just kind of print the money up? The obvious implications, Dave, is that you destroy the currency potentially. You create an enormous political incentive to debase the money, to create inflation, and to run pet political projects funded from the central bank. And you don't need to pander to your tax base anymore. You don't need to go through the hard yards of actually raising the taxes. But of course, governments have shown throughout history significant unwillingness to, once they get hold of the printing press properly, to really restrain themselves. And so you can have a situation of severe kind of consequences, inflationary consequences, and economic collapse. I don't think that's around the corner for South Africa. I think there's significant de facto and de jure kind of checks and balances on the Reserve Bank initially. But we know that the mechanisms are completely in place for the SARB to directly inject money into SASA accounts or into final recipient bank accounts. This is not technically unfeasible, and it's not constitutionally or legislatively prohibited. The South African Reserve Bank has a wide sort of array of options available to it. It's only really a kind of technocratic sensibilities within the Reserve Bank that would restrain these sort of impulses. Within the executive, I think amongst the finance minister and the president, I don't think there's a explicit willingness right now to kind of open the printing press, and then we have a sophisticated banking system in South Africa, where as much as the SARB regulates the banks kind of also loop back and sort of regulate the SARB, and it's not in the bank's best interests to have out of control inflation and monetary debasement that ultimately is detrimental for the banks. So where does this leave us, Dave? I think it leaves us looking at the situation and watching closely. We know that we've got a kind of predatory government who is desperate for resources. They're running out of taxes. They're running out of ways to raise funds. They've got a chronic overspending habit, and they're now promising even more entitlements to millions more people. That is kind of a perfect historical setup for going and corrupting the central bank and going and corrupting the monetary system. It's not happening right now. It's not happening yet, but we're moving even closer to that kind of scenario. And I think we've got to start then thinking about what that means for the rand, what that means for inflation expectations, what that means for the integrity of government bonds, the integrity of assets generally, and of course asset allocation strategies. Because if we're going to start moving into a much more inflationary era and epoch, then moving away from cash and fixed income and bond allocations is going to be more sensible. Moving towards hard assets, towards equities, towards things that generally retain their value through inflation periods would be the play. So we got to keep our eye on this. I'm not, crying wolf just yet, but we got to, I think, focus very strongly on this, Dave, because this is a kind of classic setup for monetary shenanigans down the line.
Well, thanks very much, Russ. We'll have you back on the channel one of these days to discuss the strategies that we can employ to protect our assets and our investments in light of some of these potential policy risks. My name is David Ansara. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And join us every day at 7 a.m. for another update from the Center for Risk Analysis.